They thought she was just another old woman who would break under pressure. They thought her daughter would be easy prey. They had no idea that the quiet man living 8 miles outside town was a weapon forged in the world's most dangerous places. And they definitely did not anticipate his partner, a 95-pound German Shepherd trained to end threats with surgical precision. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if you want to support the channel, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. Cascade Falls, Oregon, existed in that liminal space between civilization and wilderness, where the Cascade Range rose like ancient sentinels, guarding secrets older than memory. The town clung to the mountainside 45 miles from anywhere that mattered, population 3,200 souls who preferred it that way. Late autumn had arrived with its usual melancholy, stripping leaves from aspens and painting the landscape in shades of amber and rust. The air carried that peculiar sharpness of approaching winter, pine resin mixing with wood smoke from chimneys coming back to life after summer's dormancy. Fog rolled down from the peaks each morning like something alive, swallowing the valley in gray silence before the weak November sun burned it away. The roads twisted through dense forest, narrow and treacherous, the kind of isolation that either healed you or broke you depending on what you brought with you into the silence. James Cordell had come here to forget. 3 weeks into his stay, he was beginning to suspect that forgetting was not something his mind would permit. At 38 years old, he carried the particular stillness of someone who had spent 15 years moving through the world's darkest corners, where hesitation meant death, and mercy was a luxury measured in fractions of seconds. He stood 6'2", 210 pounds of lean functional muscle, the kind of build that came from carrying heavy gear over impossible terrain rather than posing in gymnasiums. His dark hair showed gray at the temples now, premature aging from a career that compressed decades of stress into each deployment. His face held that weathered quality of someone who had spent years squinting into hostile suns, and his dark brown eyes possessed what people politely called intensity, but was actually the permanent vigilance of someone whose survival had depended on seeing threats before they materialized. A cabin he had rented sat 8 miles outside Cascade Falls proper, accessible only by a logging road that became impassable in heavy snow. It was perfect. Single room, functional wood stove, no decoration, no sentimentality, no past. His black Ford F-150 sat outside, modified suspension handling the brutal terrain without complaint. Inside, his possessions occupied minimal space. Duffel bag of clothes, laptop with encrypted files he could not bring himself to delete, medical discharge papers he could not bring himself to read, and enough ghosts to populate a small city. He was not alone in his isolation. Titan lay near the wood stove. 95 pounds of Czech-line German Shepherd, bred for work rather than show. 6 years old, black and tan coat gleaming with health, amber eyes that missed nothing. The dog was not a pet. Pets were creatures of comfort and affection. Titan was a partner, forged through 4 deployments where they had moved as single organism through compounds and caves, where the animal's nose had detected explosives that would have vaporized them both, where his teeth had torn into hostiles, giving Cordell the seconds needed to prevail. They had retired together after Syria, after the IED that had left Cordell with partial hearing loss in his left ear and shrapnel scars across his left shoulder. After the firefight that had ended with 3 teammates in body bags while Cordell tried to compress wounds that would not stop bleeding. The nightmares came most nights. Titan would wake him with a cold nose pressed to his hand, patient and knowing, understanding trauma in ways humans pretended to but could not truly grasp. The dog responded to German commands, a remnant of his training lineage. Fuss for heel, bleep for stay, stellen for attack, words that bypassed thought and triggered action, the language of violence when violence became necessary. Their routine had settled into comfortable monotony. Pre-dawn runs on mountain trails, Cordell's breath misting in cold air while Titan ranged ahead, always circling back, always checking his position. Breakfast of military efficiency, oatmeal and black coffee, hours spent splitting firewood, the physical labor a meditation that sometimes quieted the memories. Evenings reading by firelight, Titan's head on his boot, the silence broken only by settling logs and wind through pines. The town itself Cordell visited only for necessities, hardware store for supplies, diner for occasional meals when cooking felt like more effort than it was worth. He spoke minimally, answered questions with polite brevity, and deflected attempts at friendliness with the skill of someone who had learned that distance was safer than connection. The locals had categorized him quickly: veteran, damaged, Lee can be. It was exactly the categorization he preferred. Cascade Falls possessed that particular character of small mountain towns where everyone knew everything about everyone, where secrets were currency and privacy was negotiable. Main Street stretched 3 blocks, anchored by establishments that had served the community for generations. The diner with its faded vinyl booths and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Morrison's Hardware, operated by the same family since 1947. A sheriff's station that seemed perpetually empty. The real power, Cordell had observed, with the tactical assessment that came automatically, resided in the newer building downtown, glass and steel anachronistic against the rustic charm. Cascade Development Corporation, the sign proclaimed in letters designed to project prosperity and progress. He had registered its presence the way he registered all potential threats, cataloged and filed. Relevant only if it became relevant. He had not come here to involve himself in local politics or power dynamics. He had come here to exist quietly until the screaming in his head subsided to manageable levels, until he could sleep through a night without jerking awake, reaching for a rifle that was no longer there, until he could hear a car backfire without dropping into combat crouch. 3 weeks of isolation had produced marginal improvement. The hypervigilance remained. The assessment of fields of fire when entering any space remained. The unconscious cataloging of exits and threats and potential weapons remained. These things, his therapist at the VA had explained with clinical gentleness, might never fully disappear. The brain rewired by trauma did not simply unwire because the trauma ended. You learned to function around it, to recognize when your threat assessment was disproportionate to actual danger, to breathe through the adrenaline spikes that came from stimuli only you perceived as dangerous. Titan helped more than any therapy. The dog existed in perpetual present tense, untroubled by past or future, responding to the world as it actually was, rather than how fear suggested it might be. When the animal was calm, Cordell could trust that calm. When Titan alerted, ears swiveling forward and body going rigid, Cordell knew the threat was real rather than neurological echo. It was late afternoon on his 21st day in Cascade Falls, when routine finally fractured. Cordell had driven into town for supplies, Titan occupying the passenger seat, with the patience of someone accustomed to long transports. Morrison's Hardware occupied a building that smelled of sawdust and motor oil. Narrow aisles packed with tools and supplies, organized according to logic comprehensible only to its proprietor. Cordell was examining chainsaw chains when Titan went still. The change was subtle but absolute. Ears rotated forward, amber eyes fixed on something beyond Cordell's line of sight, body shifting into the alert posture that preceded action. Not threat level requiring intervention, but interest, focus, the recognition of something worth attention. Cordell's hand dropped to the dog's shoulder, feeling the tension humming through muscle. He followed the animal's gaze toward the front of the store. An elderly woman stood at the counter, maybe late 60s, silver hair pulled into practical bun, wire-rimmed glasses perched on a face that held remnants of considerable beauty, now weathered by time and sun. She stood perhaps 5'4". Slight build, but possessing that particular quality of unbreakable dignity that some people maintained regardless of circumstances. Her hands, Cordell noticed with the detailed observation that came involuntarily, showed the calluses and wear of someone who worked with them, who did not outsource physical labor to others. She was purchasing contractor bags and heavy-duty padlocks. Her voice too low for Cordell to distinguish words, but the tension in her shoulders evident even from 30 feet away. The man behind the counter was speaking to her with the false concern that masked something uglier. Another customer, younger, maybe late 20s, leaned against the wall near the exit with studied casualness that was anything but casual. He was watching the woman with the kind of focus predators reserved for isolated prey. Titan's growl was subvocal, more vibration than sound, but Cordell felt it through his hand. "Easy," he murmured in German. "Ruhig." The woman completed her purchase with crisp efficiency, gathering her bags with movements that suggested she wanted to complete this transaction and leave as quickly as possible. As she turned toward the exit, the younger man straightened, positioning himself to intercept her path. The movement was subtle enough for plausible deniability, but obvious enough for its intended effect. Intimidation through presence. Not his business, Cordell reminded himself. Not his town, not his fight. He had come here specifically to avoid fights, to let the world handle its own problems while he tried to remember how to be something other than a weapon waiting for deployment. The woman navigated around the younger man without acknowledging his presence, movements economical and purposeful. She pushed through the door into the gray afternoon, bags clutched tight. The younger man followed after a calculated pause, hands in jacket pockets, posture radiating casual menace. The store returned to its previous quiet, as if nothing significant had transpired. Cordell completed his purchase and exited to find the parking lot empty, except for his truck, the woman's older Honda sedan, and a lifted black Dodge Ram that screamed compensation and aggression. The woman was loading her bags into the trunk while the younger man leaned against his vehicle 20 feet away, not approaching but maintaining presence, a reminder that he could approach whenever he chose. Titan's attention remained fixed on the scene. The dog's body language had shifted into something Cordell recognized from hundreds of operations. Assessment, calculation. The animal sensed distress, even if the woman's face revealed nothing but tired determination. Cordell opened the truck door. Titan did not move to enter. The dog's gaze tracked the woman as she closed her trunk and moved to the driver's door, then shifted to the younger man who had straightened, preparing to say something. The words carried across the parking lot, designed to reach both the woman and Cordell. "Tick-tock, Mrs. Chen. Clock's running out." The woman did not respond, did not turn, simply entered her vehicle and started the engine. The younger man laughed, the sound containing no humor, and climbed into his Ram. Both vehicles departed in opposite directions, leaving Cordell and Titan alone in the gathering dusk. Not his business. Cordell repeated it like mantra as he drove back to the cabin, Titan silent beside him, the dog's occasional glance toward him, carrying something that felt uncomfortably like judgment. Animals lacked the capacity for moral assessment, he reminded himself. He was projecting human complexity onto instinctive response. The evening passed in familiar routine. Fire built, simple meal prepared, book opened but words not registering. Titan lay near the stove, but his attention kept shifting to the door, ears rotating toward sounds Cordell could not detect. The dog's restlessness infected the space, creating low-level tension that Cordell tried to ignore and could not. Midnight arrived with temperature dropping toward freezing. Cordell was preparing for bed when Titan suddenly rose, body rigid, facing the door. The growl emerged, low and continuous, warning rather than challenge. Every muscle in the animal's frame had gone taut, prey drive triggered by something beyond the cabin's walls. Cordell crossed to the window, staying to the side, minimizing profile while maximizing visibility. Outside, the forest stood wrapped in darkness, broken only by starlight filtering through branches. Nothing moved. No sound reached his damaged hearing, but Titan's reaction was unambiguous. Something out there warranted attention. He retrieved the Glock 19 from the lockbox beside his bed, checked the chamber for muscle memory rather than conscious thought, and moved to the door. Titan pressed against his leg, ready but controlled, awaiting command. Cordell opened the door and stepped into cold that bit exposed skin. The night smelled of pine and approaching snow. Wind moved through branches, creating ambient sound that could mask approach. Cordell stood motionless, allowing his eyes to adjust fully, breathing slowly to calm the adrenaline response already flooding his system. Titan's head swiveled east, toward town, toward the logging road that connected this isolation to civilization. Then Cordell heard it. Faint, distant, the sound of an engine pushed too hard on rough terrain, followed by something that might have been shouting, might have been nothing. Sound traveled strangely in mountain air, bouncing off slopes and distorting distance. What seemed close could be miles away. What seemed miles away could be approaching fast. Titan whined, a rare vocalization indicating significant agitation. The dog looked up at Cordell, then back toward the sound, then up again. The message was clear even without language. Something wrong. Someone needs help. Not his business, not his town, not his fight. He had left that life behind, left the certainty that his intervention. Intention improved situations rather than complicating them. He had learned in Syria that sometimes your best efforts produced outcomes worse than inaction. That good intentions were not armor against collateral damage. But his feet were already moving toward the truck, body overriding rational mind. Titan bounded ahead, tail rigid, purpose evident in every movement. Cordell climbed into the cab, the dog leaping into passenger seat, and started the engine. He turned onto the logging road heading toward town, toward whatever situation was unfolding in the darkness. The road twisted through forest thick enough to block starlight, high beams carving tunnel through blackness. 3 miles from his cabin, Cordell spotted the turnoff to Chen property, a private drive he had noticed during his mental mapping of the area. Fresh tire tracks scarred the dirt, multiple vehicles moving fast. The shouting he had heard earlier resolved into clarity as he cupped the engine and rolled down his window. Male voices, multiple, aggressive. Beneath them, a woman's voice, steady, despite circumstances, refusing something. A younger woman's voice, higher-pitched, afraid but trying to mask fear. And something else, a child crying. Titan's growl resonated through the truck cab, deeper now, the sound he made before explosive violence. Cordell's hand found the dog's collar, holding him in place while his own nervous system completed the transition from civilian awareness to combat consciousness. Heart rate dropping, vision sharpening, time acquiring that elastic quality where seconds could be examined in granular detail. He exited the truck silently, Glock in hand, and moved into the tree line, paralleling the driveway. Titan flowed beside him, 70 pounds of controlled aggression awaiting release. 200 meters through forest brought them to the clearing where a century-old farmhouse stood illuminated by headlights from 3 vehicles. The black Ram from the hardware store, 2 other trucks, older, functional, rather than ostentatious. 5 men stood in a loose semicircle, facing the porch, where the woman from the hardware store, Mrs. Chen, stood with her back against the door. Her left arm hung at wrong angle, clearly broken. Beside her, a younger woman, maybe early 30s, held a child of perhaps 6 years old. The younger woman's face showed swelling and laceration around her left eye. Blood stained her shirt. The child was silent now, shock replacing tears, eyes too old for his age. The man from the hardware store, the one who had issued the warning about time running out, stood closest to the porch. Tick-tock just turned into deadline, Mrs. Chen. You got 24 hours to accept Mr. Vaughn's offer. After that, we stop asking nicely. Margaret Chen's voice emerged steady, despite her injury. This is my land, my home. You can tell Richard Vaughn that no amount of money will change that answer. One of the other men, older, heavily built, laughed without humor. See, that's where you're wrong. Everything has a price. You just haven't felt enough pain to find yours yet. He gestured toward the younger woman and child. Pretty daughter, cute grandson. Be a shame if something happened to them. Accidents occur in these mountains all the time. The younger woman, Sarah, pulled her son closer, her voice breaking through fear. You already put your hands on us. The police will hear about this. The heavily built man moved closer, ascending the first porch step. Sweetheart, who do you think pays the chief's salary? This whole town belongs to Mr. Vaughn. You got nobody to run to. Cordell had seen enough. He stepped from the tree line into the illumination cast by headlights. Glock held low against his thigh, Titan flowing beside him. 5 heads swiveled toward the interruption, hands dropping toward waistbands where weapons likely waited. Cordell's voice emerged flat, empty of inflection or emotion. Leave, now. The tableau held for 3 heartbeats, headlights casting harsh shadows across faces, registering surprise transitioning toward aggression. The heavily built man descended from the porch step, attention shifting entirely to Cordell. His hand completed its journey to waistband, resting on what was certainly a firearm. Well now, he said, voice thick with false amusement. Looks like we got ourselves a hero. You lost, friend? This is private property discussion. Cordell's response contained no wasted words. You are trespassing. You have assaulted these women. You threatened a child. Leave while you still can. The younger man from the hardware store, Travis, stepped forward with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences. Or what? You gonna take on all 5 of us? You and your dog? Titan's growl emerged as continuous rumble, body coiled like spring compressed beyond tolerance. The dog's amber eyes tracked movement with predatory focus, calculating. distance and approach angles with intelligence honed across deployment after deployment. Several of the men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing threat even if their bravado prevented acknowledgement. The heavily built man, clearly accustomed to command, raised his hand to forestall his associates. His eyes narrowed, examining Cordell with greater attention. The way Cordell stood, weight distributed for rapid movement. The economy of motion suggesting training far beyond civilian experience. The absolute stillness that professional violence required. "You military?" he asked, tone shifting slightly toward caution. Cordell said nothing, which was answer enough. The silence stretched, filling with possibility and consequence. Behind the men on the porch, Margaret Chen clutched her broken arm while her daughter held the trembling child. Their eyes fixed on Cordell with desperate hope, warring against fear that his intervention would escalate rather than resolve. The standoff shattered when Travis, emboldened by numbers and arrogance, moved his hand toward his waistband. He never completed the motion. Cordell covered the distance in 3 strides, striking with precision that bypassed thought. The younger man's wrist was secured and twisted, his body rotating and dropping. Face impacting dirt with force that expelled air from lungs. Cordell's knee pressed between shoulder blades, Glock now aimed at the remaining 4 men who had frozen mid-reach for their own weapons. "Nobody moves," Cordell said, voice still devoid of heat or emphasis. It was a statement of fact rather than threat, carrying absolute certainty of consequence. Titan had moved simultaneously, positioning between Cordell and the 4 men, teeth bared, every hair along his spine rigid. The dog's snarl filled the clearing, primal sound triggering instinctive response in men whose distant ancestors had learned to fear such sounds around ancient fires. The heavily built man slowly raised his hands, palms forward, recalculating the situation. Okay, easy now. We're leaving. Travis, when the man lets you up, you get in the truck. No stupidity." Cordell maintained pressure for another moment, ensuring compliance was genuine rather than tactical retreat. Then released Travis and stepped back. The younger man scrambled upright, face dirt-smeared and humiliated. But whatever response he considered died when he met Cordell's eyes. Whatever he saw there convinced him that pride was negotiable compared to survival. The 5 men retreated to their vehicles, movements careful, hands visible. Engines started, and headlights swung away, taillights disappearing down the driveway. Only when the sound of motors faded completely did Cordell lower his weapon and turn toward the porch. Margaret Chen sagged against the doorframe, adrenaline crash arriving now that immediate threat had passed. Sarah remained upright through pure will, clutching her son, who had buried his face against her shoulder. The child's silence was worse than tears, the quiet of someone learning that the world contained monsters and safety was negotiable. Cordell climbed the porch steps slowly, hands visible, movements telegraphed to avoid triggering further fear. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you need medical attention. Your arm requires setting. May I help you inside?" Margaret's eyes, sharp despite pain and shock, studied him with assessment, matching his own earlier evaluation. "Who are you?" she asked, voice steady despite circumstances. "James Cordell. I rent the cabin 8 miles north. I heard the disturbance. And you just happened to come investigate? In the middle of the night? Armed?" "Ma'am," Cordell said with patience born from years of navigating complex situations, "we can discuss my decision-making after I stabilize your injuries. You are in shock. Your daughter needs treatment. The child needs safety. Questions can wait." Something in his tone, the calm authority of someone accustomed to crisis management, penetrated Margaret's resistance. She nodded once and allowed him to guide her inside. Sarah followed, still carrying her son, while Titan took position on the porch, facing the driveway, assuming guard duty without instruction. The interior of the farmhouse spoke of generations of occupation, furniture worn but cared for, photographs covering walls documenting family history stretching back decades. Cordell guided Margaret to the kitchen table, while Sarah lowered her son into a chair. The boy, Kevin, watched Cordell with wide eyes that had seen too much tonight, processing trauma that would require years to fully integrate. Cordell's combat medic training, refreshed through repetition across too many firefights, engaged automatically. He examined Margaret's arm with gentle precision, palpating the break, assessing angle and displacement. Radial fracture, he announced. Clean break, minimal displacement, painful but manageable. Abel, I can splint it temporarily, but you need x-rays and proper casting. He turned to Sarah, whose face showed swelling that would worsen over coming hours. May I? He asked, waiting for consent before touching. She nodded, and he examined the contusion carefully, checking pupil response, asking questions to assess concussion. You will have impressive bruising, he said, but no apparent orbital fracture. Did you lose consciousness? No, Sarah whispered. He hit me, but I stayed aware. I had to. Kevin was there. You did well, Cordell said quietly. You protected your son. That required courage. Tears finally came, silent and exhausted. Margaret reached across the table with her uninjured hand to grip her daughter's fingers. Cordell retrieved his truck's first aid kit, far more comprehensive than civilian standard, and began treatment. Splint for Margaret's arm, ice pack for Sarah's face, warm blanket for Kevin, who trembled despite the heated house. As he worked, Margaret spoke, voice gaining strength. Richard Vaughn wants my land. He has wanted it for 3 years, since my husband died. He has made offer after offer, each more generous than the last. I refused every one. This property has been in my family for 4 generations. I taught school for 35 years in this town. I raised my daughter here. I will die here. Her voice hardened. 2 months ago, the offer stopped and the pressure began. Vandalism, threatening letters. My tires slashed. Tonight was the first time they put hands on us. Sarah and Kevin have been visiting for 2 weeks. She drove up from Seattle for her custody arrangement transition. They followed us home from dinner and forced us off the road. They dragged Sarah from the car. They broke my arm when I tried to intervene. Cordell secured the splint with practiced efficiency. His jaw tightened, the only external sign of rage carefully contained. Did you contact police? Margaret's laugh held bitterness. Cheese Grimes has been in Vaughn's pocket for years. Half the force is on his payroll. There is no help coming from official channels. Sarah looked up, hope and desperation mingling. You stopped them. Tonight you stopped them. Can you help us? Please, I need to know my son is safe. Cordell met her gaze, then Kevin's, then Margaret's. He saw vulnerability and courage intertwined. Civilians caught in situation beyond their capability to manage, but refusing to surrender dignity despite fear. He recognized the look. He had seen it in villages across Iraq and Afghanistan. People ground between forces they could not control. Looking to him for salvation, he was not certain he could provide. This was not intimidation anymore. This was attempted murder, dressed in plausible deniability. These men would return, emboldened by impunity, escalating until they achieved desired outcome. Margaret and her family stood no chance without intervention. They picked the wrong person to terrorize, Cordell said quietly. Cordell made the decision with finality that permitted no second guessing. You cannot stay here tonight. Pack essentials for 72 hours. We leave in 10 minutes. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Cordell continued, voice firm but not unkind. Those men will report back to whoever employs them. They will return, possibly within hours, with greater numbers and fewer inhibitions. This location is compromised. My cabin is defensible and unknown to them. We move now. The authority in his tone, born from years of issuing commands in situations where hesitation meant casualties, overrode objections. Sarah gathered clothing and necessities, while Margaret supervised despite her injury. Kevin remained silent, clutching a stuffed animal, watching Cordell with the assessment children possessed when determining trustworthiness of adults. Titan had moved inside, positioning himself near the boy, some instinct recognizing vulnerability, requiring protection. They departed in convoy, Margaret's Honda following Cordell's truck through darkness back to the cabin. The structure that had felt spacious for 1 man and 1 dog suddenly contracted with 3 additional occupants. But Cordell's military experience with cramped quarters allowed rapid adjustment. He settled the Chen family in the sleeping area while he would maintain watch from the main room. Margaret sank onto the bed with exhausted gratitude. Sarah tucked Kevin beside his grandmother, the boy finally surrendering to sleep born from emotional and physical depletion. Only when her son's breathing steadied did Sarah allow herself to fully acknowledge the evening's trauma, shoulders shaking with silent sobs she had suppressed for hours. Cordell stepped outside to give her privacy, finding Titan already ranging the perimeter, nose working scent trails, cataloging the night's information. The dog's calm posture indicated no immediate threats, allowing Cordell to begin tactical assessment of the situation he had inserted himself into. The cabin's position offered significant defensive advantages. Single access road easily monitored. Dense forest on 3 sides providing cover but also limiting approach vectors. Interior offered clear sight lines to all entry points. He had motion sensors in his gear, basic perimeter security that would provide early warning, not impregnable, but defensible against anything short of coordinated military assault. His mind shifted through scenarios and contingencies with automatic precision. Immediate priorities: establish security, gather intelligence, identify allies, plan response. He retrieved his laptop and began research, starting with Richard Vaughn and Cascade Development Corporation. What emerged painted picture of systematic predation. Vaughn, age 52. Generation wealth, built on timber and real estate, had spent the last decade consolidating control over Cascade Falls. He owned 60% of commercial properties, held mortgages on another 20% of residential land, and maintained silent partnerships in every significant business. His corporation employed 120 people in a town of 3,200, making him largest employer and therefore wielding economic power, translating directly to political control. Cordell found references to other property acquisitions, always below market value, always from owners facing sudden financial pressure or personal crisis. A pattern emerged. Identify desired property, make generous initial offer. Upon refusal, apply pressure through proxies, vandalism, harassment, mysterious financial difficulties. Eventually, owners sold at fraction of true value or simply abandoned property that Vaughn acquired through tax sales. Deeper searching revealed a lawsuit filed 2 years prior by the family of an elderly couple who had died in a house fire. The suit alleged arson and wrongful death, naming Vaughn's corporation. It had been dismissed on technicality, but the court documents contained witness statements describing intimidation identical to what Margaret faced. The couple had refused to sell. 1 month later, their house burned with them inside. Fire marshal ruled it accidental, caused by faulty wiring. The family's independent investigation suggested otherwise, but without cooperation from local authorities, their case collapsed. Cordell sat back, jaw tight. Not random thugs shaking down vulnerable widow. Organized criminal enterprise operating under corporate legitimacy, protected by corrupted local systems, with body counts suggesting willingness to escalate to murder when financial pressure proved insufficient. Dawn arrived gray and cold, November asserting its dominance over the mountain landscape. Sarah emerged from the sleeping area, moving quietly to avoid waking her mother and son. She found Cordell at the table, laptop open, pages of notes accumulated through the night. His eyes showed no fatigue despite obvious sleeplessness. The product of years learning to function on minimal rest. "You have not slept," she observed, pouring coffee from the pot he had prepared. "Sleep is negotiable," Cordell replied. "Information is not. Tell me everything about Richard Vaughn's interest in your mother's property. Why that specific land?" Sarah wrapped both hands around the mug, drawing warmth and comfort. "We do not know specifically. Mom's land is 15 acres, including a natural spring and old grove forest. It borders national forest on 2 sides, making it effectively much larger in terms of privacy and access. Dad used to joke they could disappear into those woods and never be found. But nothing about it screams commercial value. No road access worth developing. Too remote for residential subdivision." Cordell made notes. "What did your father do for work?" "He was a civil engineer, worked for the county for 30 years before retiring. He loved that land more than anything except Mom and me. His death 3 years ago was hard, but Mom refused to leave. She said it would be abandoning him." "When did Vaughn first approach her?" "Within 3 months of Dad's death. Almost like he was waiting for her to be vulnerable and alone." Cordell's mind cataloged the timeline. Predatory but patient. Vaughn had not acted impulsively but strategically. Waiting for optimal moment when grief might make Margaret more amenable to selling. When direct approach failed, he had shifted to intimidation, escalating slowly over years to tonight's violence. A vehicle approached on the logging road, engine sound triggering immediate response. Cordell was on his feet, Glock in hand, moving to window position that offered visibility while minimizing exposure. Titan materialized beside him, ears forward, body tense but not yet aggressive, the stance indicating unknown rather than threat. The vehicle that emerged from treeline was not truck. Ruck full of Vaughn's men, but rather a small sedan, older model, driven by a woman who parked and exited with hands visible, clearly aware she was being observed and assessed. She was perhaps late 20s, athletic build, dark curly hair, wearing waitress uniform beneath open jacket. Her posture suggested tension, but not fear, someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. She stopped 20 feet from the cabin and called out, "James Cordell? My name is Elena Vasquez. I am a friend, or I hope to be. I have information you need." Cordell opened the door, remaining in threshold, weapon lowered but accessible. Titan stood beside him, silent evaluation ongoing. "How do you know my name?" "Small town. Veteran renting isolated cabin is noteworthy. Man who intervened last night at the Chen property is big news this morning. Vaughn's people are not subtle when humiliated." "You work for Vaughn?" Cordell's voice contained no accusation, merely gathering data. "I work at the diner, which Vaughn owns like he owns everything else. But I do not work for him. I work against him. Have been for 6 months." She reached slowly into her jacket, producing a manila envelope and held it up. "I am an investigative journalist for the Portland Tribune. I have been researching Vaughn's land acquisitions, documenting his pattern of intimidation and suspected arson. What happened to Margaret Chen is not isolated. It is systematic. And I have proof." Cordell studied Elena for 3 seconds that stretched into careful assessment. Her body language read as genuine, tension born from danger of her position rather than deception. Titan's posture had relaxed incrementally, the dog's threat evaluation downgrading from unknown to acceptable. Animal instinct sometimes exceeded human judgment in detecting malicious intent. "Come inside," Cordell said, stepping aside, quickly. Elena entered and he secured the door behind her, noting how her eyes immediately mapped the space, cataloging exits and occupants with awareness suggesting experience in hostile environments. Sarah had emerged from the sleeping area, recognition flashing across her face. "You are the waitress from the diner. You served us dinner last night, before they ran us off the road." Elena nodded. "I saw Travis Vaughn follow you out. I tried to warn you but could not without exposing myself. I am sorry I could not do more." She placed the envelope on the table and extracted documents, spreading them with practiced efficiency. Financial records, property transfers, correspondence between Vaughn and various parties, witness statements she had collected covertly over months of investigation. "Richard Vaughn has forced out 7 families in 3 years," she began, voice carrying controlled anger of someone who had stared too long at injustice. Each time, the pattern repeats. Generous initial offer, systematic harassment following refusal. Eventually, owners sell for fraction of value or abandon property entirely. In 2 cases, properties suffered mysterious fires. One family barely escaped, another was not so fortunate. She pulled forward photographs of an elderly couple, smiling in happier context, and then crime scene photos of charred remains of their home. Harold and June Martinez, married 53 years, refused Vaughn's offer on their property. 1 month later, their house burned at 3 in the morning. Fire marshal ruled it electrical malfunction. Independent investigation suggested accelerant use, but local authorities refused to pursue it. Their daughter filed wrongful death suit that was dismissed. Cordell examined the documents with focus honed through years of intelligence analysis in combat zones. The evidence was substantial, but circumstantial, suggesting pattern without providing definitive proof of Vaughn's direct involvement. Any competent lawyer would argue coincidence and lack of concrete connection. Why not take this to federal authorities? FBI handles interstate criminal activity and public corruption. Elena's expression hardened. "I tried. Portland Field Office thanked me for my concern and said without cooperation from local law enforcement or willingness of victims to testify, they lack jurisdiction to investigate. Most families Vaughn targeted have left the area. Those remaining are too terrified to speak. Until last night, I had documentation but no active case they could not ignore." Her eyes met Cordell's directly. "You changed that calculation. You witnessed assault and attempted murder." Margaret Chen and her daughter are credible witnesses with visible injuries. You are former military with no local connections that compromise credibility. If you are willing to provide testimony, combined with my documentation, we have foundation for federal case. Cordell processed the implications. Testifying meant visibility, involvement, becoming target himself. It meant abandoning the isolation he had sought, the distance from violence and consequence he needed to heal. It meant accepting that his war had not ended with his discharge, but merely relocated to different terrain against different enemies. Sarah spoke quietly from where she stood. My son watched those men threaten to hurt him to coerce my mother. He heard them laugh about burning people alive. If we do nothing, they will come back. They will keep coming until Mom gives up her home or until something worse happens. Cordell looked at her bruised face, then toward the sleeping area where Margaret and Kevin rested, then down at Titan, who sat attentively, amber eyes reflecting firelight. The dog's presence beside him was a reminder of oaths taken and principles that transcended personal convenience. Protecting those unable to protect themselves. Standing against predators who believed power granted immunity. I will testify, he said simply. What else do you need? Elena released breaths she had been holding. I need time to compile complete case file. I need you to keep the Chens safe for 48 hours while I coordinate with FBI contact willing to listen. And I need you to understand that once Vaughn knows you are serious obstacle rather than temporary nuisance, he will come at you with everything he has. Let him come, Cordell said, voice flat and certain. This cabin is defensible. I have supplies and equipment. He sends men. Those men will not return. The next hours passed in controlled preparation. Cordell inventoried his resources, military experience translating civilian supplies into tactical assets. He had motion sensors originally purchased for wildlife monitoring that now became perimeter alarms. Propane cylinders could be repurposed as deterrents. The cabin's construction, solid logs and limited access points provided natural fortification. He walked the property with Titan, identifying optimal positions for defense and fallback routes if withdrawal became necessary. The dog ranged ahead, marking territory, understanding through training and instinct that they were establishing defensive perimeter. Cordell placed sensors at intervals along the access road and through likely approach vectors in the forest, each transmitting to receiver in the cabin that would alert to movement. Inside, Sarah tended her mother and son while Elena organized documentation. Margaret's pain had intensified as shock wore off, but she refused stronger medication that might cloud her judgment. She wanted to remain alert, aware, capable of protecting her grandson if circumstances required. Her broken arm rendered her physically limited, but her resolve remained absolute. Cordell made a call on his satellite phone, the encrypted device a remnant of his military career that he maintained despite civilian status. The number connected to Marcus Reed, special agent with the FBI's Portland field office, a man who had served as Marine infantry before transitioning to federal law enforcement. More importantly, Marcus owed Cordell his life from a firefight in Afghanistan, where Cordell's unit had extracted Marines pinned by enemy combatants. Ghost. Marcus said, using Cordell's call sign, surprise evident in his voice. Been 2 years. You finally ready to take that consulting job I offered? Different situation, Cordell replied. I need your help. Public corruption case, attempted murder, possible arson murders, local law enforcement compromised, victims too terrified to come forward until now. He briefed Marcus with military precision, facts without embellishment, timeline and evidence summarized efficiently. Marcus listened without interruption, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated both professional competence and personal concern. Can you get me something official? Cordell asked. Federal interest, even preliminary, changes the tactical landscape. These people believe they operate with impunity. Give me 6 hours, Marcus said. I will coordinate with appropriate divisions. If what you are telling me checks out, and it sounds like it will, we will open investigation. But Ghost, you need to understand that federal machinery moves carefully. We cannot send tactical teams based on preliminary evidence. You might be exposed for days before we can mobilize resources. Understood, Cordell said. Just make it official so they know this is not local matter anymore. He disconnected and turned to find everyone watching him. Their expressions held hope warring with fear. Awareness that they had committed to path that could end in triumph or tragedy with little middle ground. Evening arrived with temperature dropping sharply, stars emerging in clear sky that promised frost by morning. Cordell prepared simple meal while maintaining situational awareness, attention divided between cooking and monitoring perimeter sensors. Titan dozed near the stove, conserving energy, but his ears rotated constantly, processing. Sing ambient sound for anomalies. They ate with subdued conversation, exhaustion and stress suppressing appetite. Kevin picked at his food, trauma manifesting as withdrawal, the child existing somewhere inside his own mind where adults could not reach. Margaret tried to engage him with gentle questions that received monosyllabic responses or silence. Sarah's eyes held tears she refused to shed, guilt at bringing her son into danger, overwhelming rational knowledge that she bore no fault. Cordell cleared dishes and was preparing watch rotation when Titan suddenly rose, body going rigid, facing the door. The growl that emerged was different from earlier warnings, deeper, more primal, the sound that preceded violence rather than deterrence. Every hair along the dog's spine stood erect. Cordell's hand found his Glock as he moved to the window. Outside, headlights appeared on the access road, multiple vehicles approaching in formation. Not the cautious arrival of uncertain attackers, but the confident advance of superior force. He counted lights. 5 vehicles, estimate 20 men. They are here, he said quietly. Everyone to the back room, now. Sarah gathered Kevin while Elena helped Margaret toward the sleeping area that offered most protection. Interior walls and distance from windows, providing marginal safety if situation deteriorated to gunfire. Cordell moved to fortified position beside the window, Glock in hand, spare magazines within reach. Titan positioned at the door, muscles coiled, awaiting command. The vehicles stopped 50 meters from the cabin, headlights creating harsh illumination that washed out night vision while leaving attackers in relative darkness. Cordell recognized the tactical disadvantage immediately. They had learned from the previous encounter, approaching with numerical superiority and better preparation. Doors opened and men emerged, count confirming his estimate. 20 individuals, most carrying visible weapons, handguns and shotguns catching light. They formed loose perimeter, blocking retreat routes, movements suggesting coordination beyond simple thuggery. Someone had provided tactical instruction, possibly the heavily built man from the Chen property who carried himself with authority of prior law enforcement or military experience. A voice called from behind the headlights, amplified by megaphone, words designed to carry into the cabin and surrounding forest. James Cordell, we know you are inside with the Chen family. You have involved yourself in business that does not concern you. This is your opportunity to walk away. Leave now and this ends peacefully. Cordell remained silent, assessing angles and options. The cabin's log construction would stop handgun rounds, but buckshot and rifle fire could penetrate, especially through windows. He had defensible position but was outnumbered and outgunned, with civilians requiring protection, limiting his tactical options. Aggressive response would trigger firefight. He might survive, but they would not. The voice continued when no response came. Mr. Vaughn is generous man. He appreciates your military service and respects your capabilities. He is willing to compensate you for your time and trouble. $20,000 cash if you step outside right now and walk away. The Chen family's problems are not your concern. From the sleeping area, Margaret's voice emerged, weakened by pain but fierce with conviction. Do not listen to him. Do not let them buy your integrity. Cordell had no intention of accepting, but the offer confirmed what he had suspected. Vaughn was not present, sending proxies to handle unpleasant work while maintaining deniability. The men outside were tools, employees following orders, most probably unaware of full scope of crimes they facilitated. They believed they confronted obstacle that could be removed through intimidation or bribery. He made decision with clarity, born from years of combat leadership. Sometimes strategic withdrawal was wisest course. The cabin was defensible, but not impregnable. Prolonged siege would favor attackers who could rotate personnel and bring additional resources. Better to concede this ground while maintaining initiative elsewhere. Cordell called out, voice carrying through door without shouting. I am coming out, weapons holstered. Nobody moves aggressively or this escalates. He turned to find Sarah in the doorway, face stricken. "You are leaving us? After everything?" Cordell met her eyes. "I am preventing bloodshed that would traumatize your son further and potentially kill people who do not deserve to die for following orders they do not fully understand. This fight is not over. It is being relocated to terrain more favorable to our victory." He gave Titan the command for stay and guard in German. "Bleib, bewachen." The dog whined protest but obeyed, positioning himself between the sleeping area and the door. Cordell holstered his Glock, raised his hands to shoulder height, and opened the door. Cold night air hit him as he stepped onto the porch. Hands visible, movements slow and deliberate. 20 weapons tracked him, tension radiating from men uncertain whether this was surrender or prelude to violence. The heavily built man from earlier, Derek Moss, according to Elena's documentation, stepped forward. "Smart choice," Moss said. "Military men understand cost-benefit analysis. No point dying for people you barely know." Cordell descended the steps, mind cataloging faces and positions, marking who held weapons with confidence versus who gripped them with fear. He stopped 10 feet from Moss, hands still raised, posture non-threatening, but balanced for explosive movement if necessary. "The Chen family leaves with me," Cordell said quietly. "You let them drive away unmolested. I disappear from Cascade Falls. Everyone goes home tonight." Moss smiled without warmth. "That is not how this works. They stay, you leave. Tomorrow Mrs. Chen signs paperwork transferring her property. Everyone lives happily after." Cordell's voice dropped to register that carried authority without volume. "If you touch them again, I will come back. When I do, it will not be to negotiate. I will dismantle everything Vaughn has built, piece by piece, person by person, until he has nothing left but prison cell. That is not threat." In his tactical assessment of consequences, the smile faded from Moss's face. He stepped closer, entering conversational distance, voice lowering so only Cordell could hear. "You think you are first person to threaten Richard Vaughn? Men with more resources and connections have tried. They all failed. You are alone, outgunned, and out of legal options. Take the money and disappear while you still can." Cordell held his gaze, seeing past bravado to calculation underneath. Moss was intelligent enough to recognize genuine threat, experienced enough to understand that Cordell's calm was more dangerous than bluster. But he was also committed, financially dependent on Vaughn, too deep into criminality to extract himself even if he wanted to. The standoff held for 5 seconds before sound of approaching vehicles fractured the tension. Headlights appeared on the access road, multiple sets, moving fast. Moss turned, confusion crossing his face. The vehicles that emerged were not reinforcements, but rather black SUVs with government plates, followed by marked Oregon State Police units. They stopped in formation, and doors opened, disgorging men wearing windbreakers emblazoned with FBI in yellow letters. Leading them was Marcus Reed, special agent badge displayed prominently, service weapon holstered but accessible. Behind him, a dozen agents spread into tactical positions, establishing control through presence and authority. Marcus's voice carried command authority, honed through military and federal service. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody moves. Hands where we can see them." Moss's face cycled through shock to calculation to resignation within seconds. His men looked to him for guidance, finding none, and slowly raised their hands. They had come prepared for confrontation with isolated veteran, not federal response suggesting investigation far exceeding local dispute. Marcus approached Cordell, expression neutral, but eyes showing relief. "We monitored your sat phone location. When I saw how many heat signatures converged on your position, I activated tactical response team already staging in Bend for different operation. Fortunate timing." Cordell lowered his hands, the tension draining from his shoulders in increments. "Appreciated timing," he replied quietly. Federal agents moved through Vaughn's men, separating and identifying them, securing weapons. Miranda rights were administered to those who showed signs of fleeing or resistance. The operation proceeded with practiced efficiency, no wasted movement or unnecessary force. Margaret, Sarah, and Kevin emerged from the cabin, Elena supporting Margaret, who swayed with exhaustion and pain medication finally taking effect. Kevin clung to his mother, face pressed against her shoulder, refusing to look at the chaos of lights and law enforcement activity surrounding them. Marcus approached the family with gentleness that contradicted his imposing physical presence. "Mrs. Chen, I am Special Agent Marcus Reed. We have opened federal investigation into Richard Vaughn and Cascade Development Corporation based on evidence suggesting pattern of interstate criminal activity, public corruption, and civil rights violations. I need statements from you and your daughter. I need documentation of your injuries, and I need you to trust that you are safe now." Margaret's voice emerged as hoarse whisper. "What about Vaughn? He did not come tonight. He never does his own violence." Marcus exchanged glance with Cordell before responding. Tactical team is moving on his residence simultaneously with this operation. By the time sun rises, Richard Vaughn will be in federal custody, answering questions about his business practices, his associates, and his role in multiple suspected felonies. Across town, simultaneous events unfolded at the Vaughn estate. Richard Vaughn sat in his study, surrounded by luxury purchased through decades of exploitation. When motion sensors alerted to vehicles approaching his gated property, he moved to the security monitors, expecting to see Derek Moss returning with confirmation that the Chen problem had been permanently resolved. Instead, the screens showed federal vehicles, agents in tactical gear, warrants being displayed to his overnight security personnel, who wisely chose not to resist. Vaughn's mind raced through options and contingencies, calculating escape routes and legal defenses, but underneath the panic was growing realization that his insulation had finally failed. He reached for his phone to call his attorney, but the device was already dead, communications jammed by federal equipment. The study door opened, and agents entered with weapons drawn, voices commanding him to show his hands, to get on his knees, to submit to arrest with dignity or without it, but submit regardless. "Richard Vaughn, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit arson, intimidation of witnesses, and conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. You have the right to remain silent." The words continued, but Vaughn barely heard them through the roaring in his ears, the sound of empire collapsing, of immunity shattering, of consequences he had believed would never arrive, finally manifesting with federal authority he could not bribe or threaten or intimidate into retreat. Dawn broke over Cascade Falls with the peculiar clarity that follows storms, literal or metaphorical, when air feels scrubbed clean and light possesses sharp quality that renders everything in precise detail. The town woke to news that spread through coffee shops and street corners with velocity that only small communities achieve, each person adding layers of speculation to foundation of verified fact. Richard Vaughn, the man who had owned their town through economic leverage and cultivated fear, sat in federal holding facility, facing charges that could consume the remainder of his life. His arrest had triggered cascade of additional warrants, agents executing searches of Cascade Development Corporation offices, seizing financial records and computers, interviewing employees who suddenly discovered cooperation was preferable to obstruction. Derek Moss and 3 of his associates faced their own federal charges. Conspiracy and assault added to longer list of crimes being constructed as investigators peeled back years of systematic intimidation. Chief Walter Grimes had been suspended pending investigation into his financial relationship with Vaughn, bank records reviewing regular deposits that dramatically exceeded his official salary. 2 other officers faced similar scrutiny, the corruption having metastasized through the small department until it barely functioned as legitimate law enforcement. Cordell sat in conference room at the FBI's temporary command post established in Cascade Falls Municipal Building, providing detailed statement to agents who recorded every word. He described the hardware store encounter, the assault at the Chen property, the confrontation at his cabin, each memory rendered with precision that came from training and natural observational acuity. His testimony was clinical, devoid of emotional embellishment, facts presented in chronological sequence that prosecutors would find compelling in its straightforward credibility. Margaret Chen provided her own statement from hospital bed, where orthopedic surgeon had properly set and casted her broken arm. The pain medication dulled the sharp edges of her fear, but could not erase 3 years of escalating harassment, threats that had stolen her peace and transformed her home into battleground. She spoke of vandalism and intimidation, of watching her town succumb to corruption, of feeling abandoned by institutions meant to protect her. Sarah's statement focused on the assault itself, the moment Travis Vaughn had struck her while his associates restrained her mother. The terror of watching her son witness violence that would require therapy and time to process. She described Derek Moss's explicit threats against Kevin, words that crossed from intimidation into terroristic threat, federal crime carrying substantial prison sentence. Elena Vasquez turned over 6 months of investigative journalism, documentation so thorough that federal prosecutors treated her work as foundation for their case rather than supplementary evidence. Financial records traced money from Vaughn's accounts to offshore entities and back through laundering schemes that suggested sophistication beyond local criminal enterprise. Property transfer documents revealed pattern of coerced sales, prices well below market value, owners who had suffered mysterious hardships immediately before selling. Most damning was evidence regarding Harold and June Martinez, the elderly couple who had died in house fire 2 years prior. Elena had located fire investigator who had been overruled by his chief when he recommended arson investigation. The investigator, now retired and willing to testify, had kept copies of his original report showing burn patterns consistent with accelerant use and multiple points of origin. His chief, also on Vaughn's payroll, had ordered the case closed as accidental. The Martinez family, contacted by federal agents, provided their own documentation, including threatening letters received by Harold in the weeks before his death. The letters had been dismissed by local police as pranks, but forensic analysis now revealed fingerprints matching Derek Moss on 2 of them, combined with financial records showing payment from Vaughn to Moss 3 days after the fire. The circumstantial evidence constructed narrative of murder for hire that transformed property dispute into capital crime. Marcus Reed coordinated the expanding investigation with efficiency that demonstrated why he had risen rapidly through federal ranks. He assembled task force drawing resources from multiple field offices, bringing specialists in financial crimes, public corruption, and organized criminal activity. What had begun as local harassment case had metastasized into federal prosecution that would likely require years to fully litigate, but whose outcome was increasingly inevitable. Cordell completed his statement and emerged from the municipal building to find Cascade Falls transformed. People moved through streets with posture subtly changed, fear replaced by cautious optimism, conversations happening openly rather than in whispers. The town was reclaiming itself in real time, collective courage returning as the apparatus of intimidation dismantled. He drove to the hospital where the Chen family had been moved for Margaret's treatment and Sarah's evaluation. Kevin had finally spoken. Single sentence that broke his mother's heart and filled her with relief simultaneously. He had asked if the bad men were gone, voice small, but seeking reassurance that safety was not temporary illusion. Cordell found them in private room, Margaret sleeping under influence of pain medication, while Sarah sat beside her son, reading from book with determined cheerfulness. Kevin looked up when Cordell entered, eyes showing recognition and something that might have been trust. "Are they gone?" the boy asked, echoing his earlier question. "The bad men?" Cordell knelt to bring himself to child's eye level, aware that his answer would shape how Kevin processed trauma. "They are gone," he said quietly. "They cannot hurt you or your grandmother. Police have them, and they will face consequences for what they did." "Because you stopped them," Kevin said. "You and Titan." "Many people stopped them," Cordell replied. "Your mother protected you. Your grandmother refused to give up. Other people gathered evidence and called for help. I was just one part." Sarah's eyes glistened with tears she had held through crisis but could no longer contain in safety. She reached across and gripped Cordell's hand, words inadequate for the gratitude she felt. "You gave us our lives back, our home, our future. How do we possibly thank you for that?" Cordell felt profound discomfort with praise, deflecting as he always did. "I did what anyone should do when confronted with injustice. But most people do not," Sarah said softly. "Most people look away. You chose to see, and then you chose to act. That makes all the difference." Margaret stirred, pain medication wearing off enough to permit partial consciousness. Her eyes focused on Cordell with clarity despite her condition. "Will you stay?" she asked, voice rough but determined. Cascade Falls needs people like you, people willing to stand when others cannot. Cordell stood, suddenly restless, aware that the question touched nerve he was not prepared to examine. I have leave time ending soon. Military obligations resuming. I cannot make promises about futures that remain uncertain. The truth was more complicated. He had come to Cascade Falls seeking isolation, distance from violence, space to heal wounds both physical and psychological. Instead, he had found purpose, reminded that his training and experience were not solely instruments of destruction, but also tools of protection. The intervention had cost him the peace he sought, but had given him something more valuable. Proof that he could channel his nature toward creation rather than annihilation, that being warrior was not incompatible with being healer. He spent the afternoon assisting federal agents, his tactical knowledge helping them understand defensive positions Vaughn's men had established and weapons they had carried. He provided context for their capabilities and training levels, assessment that would inform charging decisions and prosecution strategies. Evening found him back at his cabin, now cleared by FBI as crime scene, and returned to his use. The space felt different. No longer sanctuary of isolation, but rather place where he had made stand, where principle had superseded preference. Titan moved through the rooms, sniffing corners and doorways, reclaiming territory that had been briefly contested. Cordell stood on the porch, watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of copper and gold. His satellite phone rang, display showing Marcus's number. He answered to hear relief and satisfaction in his friend's voice. Vaughn is cooperating, Marcus said. Or rather, his attorney is negotiating cooperation in exchange for reduced sentencing. He is providing information on other operations, other towns where similar patterns occurred. We are looking at potential RICO charges, criminal enterprise spanning decade and multiple states. Your intervention did not just save the Chen family. It broke open something much larger. Cordell absorbed the information without satisfaction or pride. Good, he said simply. They deserve justice. What about you? Marcus asked. You going to stay in Cascade Falls? Town could use someone like you, especially during transition as they rebuild legitimate governance. Cordell had been asking himself the same question throughout the day. His leave time officially ended in 2 weeks, requiring return to base for administrative processing of his medical retirement. After that, he would be civilian in absolute terms, free to choose location and purpose without military obligation constraining options. I need to complete separation processing, he said carefully. After that, I do not know. Too many variables remain unresolved. They spoke for few more minutes before disconnecting. Cordell remained on the porch as darkness gathered, Titan pressing against his leg, solid presence grounding him. The dog looked up with amber eyes that held no judgment. Only patient acceptance of whatever decision his human would make. Maybe, Cordell thought, peace was not found in isolation, but in choosing when to stand and when to rest, in accepting that carrying his capabilities to those who needed them was not burden but gift. Maybe the war had not ended, had merely changed theaters and objectives, and maybe that was acceptable. 3 months later, winter had fully claimed the Cascade Range, transforming the landscape into study of whites and grays punctuated by dark evergreens bowing under snow weight. Cascade Falls had settled into new equilibrium, corruption excised like cancer, communities slowly rebuilding trust in institutions that had betrayed them. James Cordell stood in the small apartment he had rented in town proper, packing gear with the methodical efficiency of someone who had moved countless times across continents and combat zones. His medical retirement had been finalized, discharge papers signed, last connections to Navy severed with ceremony that felt both momentous and anticlimactic. He was civilian now in legal fact, though his bearing and awareness would forever mark him as something forged in harder fires. The trial was set for spring, federal prosecutors constructing case with thoroughness that suggested no possibility of acquittal. Richard Vaughn faced 73 counts spanning financial crimes, civil rights violations, conspiracy to commit murder, and racketeering charges that would likely result in life sentence for a 52-year-old man whose health was already deteriorating under stress of incarceration. Derek Moss had accepted plea agreement, 20 years in federal prison, in exchange for testimony against his former employer. Chief Grimes faced his own trial. corruption charges that would end his career and likely his freedom. The Martinez family had filed wrongful death lawsuit, now supported by federal evidence that vindicated their original suspicions. 6 other families who had been forced from their properties were exploring legal options for restitution. Civil courts, preparing to redistribute wealth Vaughn had accumulated through intimidation and violence. Cascade Falls had elected new chief of police through special process, bringing in candidate from outside with clean record and reputation for integrity. Town council had passed new ordinances limiting concentration of property ownership, defensive measures to prevent future consolidation of power. The changes were imperfect and incomplete, but they represented commitment to governance that served community rather than individual interests. Margaret Chen had returned to her farmhouse. Farmhouse, structure fortified with new security system, and surrounded by community members who had found courage to support her openly, rather than offering only private sympathy. Her arm had healed with minimal complications, and she had resumed her quiet life, tending her land and maintaining the legacy her husband had built over decades. Sarah and Kevin had remained for additional month before returning to Seattle, the boy having undergone therapy that helped him process trauma into narrative he could integrate rather than suppress. He spoke of the experience now with child's directness, describing the scary men and the soldier with the dog who had made them go away. His nightmares had decreased in frequency and intensity, healing occurring in increments that would likely continue for years, but showed promising trajectory. Elena Vasquez had published her investigative series, work winning regional journalism awards and leading to job offer from major newspaper in Portland. She had accepted, leaving Cascade Falls, but maintaining contact with sources who continued providing information about corruption in other rural communities where similar patterns emerged. Her work had become template for investigating systematic property theft, disguised as legitimate business practice. Cordell had testified before grand jury, his statement forming cornerstone of prosecution case. Federal attorneys had praised his precision and credibility, suggesting that his military record and obvious competence made him ideal witness. He had accepted their gratitude with characteristic discomfort, deflecting credit while maintaining professional cooperation. His apartment overlooked Main Street, position providing clear sightlines and awareness of movement patterns. Tactical assessment that would never fully disengage. Titan dozed near the window, gray appearing in the dog's muzzle now. 7 years of hard service leaving marks that would only accumulate. The animal had settled into civilian life with greater ease than Cordell, content as long as his human remained present and Popus occasionally emerged. A knock interrupted his packing. Margaret Chen stood in the hallway, leaning on cane, necessitated by lingering weakness in her healing arm, but her eyes held the fierce determination that had allowed her to withstand years of pressure. She carried envelope and expression suggesting important purpose. "James," she said, voice formal. "May I come in?" He stepped aside, gesturing her to the single chair his sparse furnishings provided. She settled with visible relief, age and injury combining to make movement difficult. Titan approached and rested his head on her knee, receiving gentle scratching behind ears with appreciation both enjoyed. "I wanted to thank you properly before you left," Margaret began. "Words feel inadequate for what you did, but they are all I have. You gave me my home, my safety, my ability to live without fear. Those are gifts beyond price." Cordell remained standing, uncomfortable with gratitude he did not feel he had earned. "You would have prevailed eventually. Elena's investigation would have succeeded. Federal attention was inevitable." Margaret shook her head firmly. "Perhaps, or perhaps Vaughn would have succeeded in forcing me out, and the pattern would have continued until someone died and evidence became impossible to ignore. You accelerated justice and prevented additional victims. That matters." She extended the envelope. "This is deed to 5 acres on the northern border of my property. It includes cabin site with utilities access and borders national forest. I want you to have it." Cordell stared at the envelope without taking it. "Ma'am, I cannot accept payment for doing what was right." "It is not payment," Margaret said quietly. "It is gift. It is community saying you belong here if you choose. It is request that you stay, because Cascade Falls needs people willing to stand against injustice, and you have proven yourself to be exactly that person." Cordell felt resistance warring with something deeper, hunger for belonging he had suppressed for years while moving through temporary assignments and deployments that prevented permanent connection. "I do not know if I am staying," he admitted. "I do not know what comes next." "Then keep the land as option," Margaret pressed. "Build on it or leave it wild. Return when you are ready or never return. But know that you have place here, that you are welcome, that this community considers you one of their own." She stood with effort, leaving the envelope on the chair. "One more thing. Sarah wanted me to tell you that Kevin speaks of you often. He says when he grows up, he wants to be like the soldier who protected his grandmother. You gave him model of courage and integrity exactly when he needed it most. That is legacy that will shape his entire life." She moved to the door, pausing in threshold. "Whatever you decide, wherever you go, thank you. Some debts can never be fully repaid, but they can be acknowledged with grateful hearts." After she left, Cordell picked up the envelope but did not open it. He looked at Titan, who watched him with patient amber eyes that held no judgment, only acceptance. The dog's tail wagged once, slow sweep that somehow communicated approval of whatever decision his human reached. Cordell's phone buzzed with message from Marcus Reed. Simple text containing link to news article about situation developing in small town 300 miles south. Pattern of harassment, targeting immigrant families, local authorities unresponsive, community desperate for intervention. The message included no request or pressure, merely information that Marcus knew Cordell would want to assess. He opened his laptop and researched the situation. Tactical mind automatically cataloging details and calculating response options. The pattern was familiar. Predatory behavior enabled by official indifference, vulnerable population lacking resources to resist. It was not his problem. He had no obligation to involve himself in conflicts that were not his own. But he had learned something in Cascade Falls. His skills, his training, his willingness to stand when others could not. These things had value beyond military context. Wars were fought on many terrains, against many enemies, and sometimes the most important battles occurred in small towns where injustice thrived because good people believed themselves powerless. Titan rose and moved to the door, looking back expectantly. The dog knew before Cordell consciously decided. They were not staying in Cascade Falls, but neither were they retreating into isolation. They were needed elsewhere. And need was something neither of them could ignore. Cordell closed his laptop and resumed packing, but now with different destination in mind. He would keep Margaret's land, anchor point he could return to when time allowed, but for now, there was work to be done. Other families needed protection. Other communities required someone willing to tip scales toward justice when corruption threatened to prevail. Maybe the most important battles were fought protecting the innocent at home rather than abroad. Maybe being warrior was not about carrying rifle through hostile territory, but about standing between predators and prey wherever that line needed defending. Maybe his war had not ended, but merely evolved, and maybe that was exactly as it should be. He loaded his truck as afternoon light slanted through streets transformed by his intervention. People waved as he passed. Recognition and gratitude evident in their gestures. He returned acknowledgement with brief nod, uncomfortable with attention, but understanding that community needed to express what it felt. On the edge of town, he stopped at the Chen farmhouse. Margaret stood on the porch, bundled against cold, waving farewell. Cordell raised his hand in return, promise implicit in the gesture. He would return. This was not ending, but rather beginning. Foundation upon which he would build whatever came next. Titan sat in passenger seat, alert and ready, partner in every sense. The dog's presence was reminder that he did not face whatever came alone, that bonds forged in hardship transcended simple human-animal relationship to become something approaching sacred trust. As Cordell drove south toward new situation, requiring assessment and potential intervention, he felt something he had not experienced in years. Not peace, exactly, but purpose. Not happiness, but rightness. Not healing, but progress toward it. Because somewhere out there, someone was waiting for a hero. Someone was facing injustice they lacked power to resist. Someone needed proof that courage still existed, that standing against corruption was possible, that one person willing to act could change everything. And when duty called, James Cordell and Titan would answer. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in Cordell's position. Would you have walked away or stood your ground? Share this story with someone who needs reminder that courage still exists in this world. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand. One person who refuses to look away when injustice occurs. One person who believes that protecting the innocent is not burden, but calling. May you find your own courage when the moment requires it. May you stand when others cannot. And may you never forget that being a warrior is not about seeking violence, but about refusing to permit it against those who cannot defend themselves. God bless you all, wherever you are watching from. Until the next story, stay strong, stay vigilant, and remember that heroes are not born. They are ordinary people who choose extraordinary action when circumstances demand it.